March 14, 1945. The wind cut across the muddy field surrounding Camp Ashwood like a thin, bitter blade, carrying the sharp tang of wet straw and the distant smoke of fires that had not yet been fully extinguished. A group of German women shuffled along the rough path toward the wooden barracks, their shoes scuffing against frozen earth, their hands clutching threadbare coats and tattered bundles. They had heard rumors of American camps, of soldiers who, despite their uniforms, might show kindness. But that rumor was thin comfort after years of fear, after months of being pressed into roles they had never chosen, their bodies treated like tools of a war that cared little for them. The first woman, her hair streaked with ash and dust, paused at the edge of the fence. She could see the sentries pacing, rifles slung low, but faces unreadable. Her lips parted, ready to cry out, to scream if the guards showed cruelty. But the soldiers merely nodded, motioned her forward, and a cold hand on a shoulder steadied her trembling. Her eyes widened. She had expected snarls, threats, maybe even blows. Instead, there was a strange civility, a recognition of her humanity that she had thought lost. Inside the barracks, the women huddled in the corners, the wooden walls creaking with the weight of unfamiliar silence. It smelled of boiled potatoes, damp wool, and soap, a scent so ordinary it was almost absurd after the chaos they had endured. One woman, clutching a bundle of her meager possessions, nearly dropped it when a soldier bent down to help her. His hands were careful, awkward, fumbling over the knots and fraying edges, but never rough. For the first time in months, she felt eyes meeting hers without calculation, without lust or threat. They had been trained to expect men like this, cruel, indifferent, capable of every imaginable degradation. The term comfort women had become a scar in their minds, a constant reminder that their bodies were considered instruments, their identities secondary. Some had been forced into labor, others had endured the unspeakable. In the open field beyond the camp, they could see the burned-out remains of villages, the skeletal husks of farms where neighbors had disappeared overnight. And yet here in this camp, the men in uniform treated them with a strange, cautious respect. Statistics from early 1945 note that tens of thousands of German civilians were being processed in American camps, but the numbers could not capture the emotional vertigo these women felt. It was not just survival they had feared, it was recognition, dignity, the small acts of decency that made one feel alive. And here, in the creaking wooden barracks of Camp Ashwood, those acts were beginning to emerge. Soldiers guided them to benches, offered blankets without comment, and waited patiently while the women struggled with their few possessions. Historically, the U.S. Army had explicit rules about the treatment of civilian internees. Guards were briefed, no abuse, no intimidation, maintain order, respect human dignity. It was protocol, yes, but for women who had learned that every protocol could hide a whip or a weapon, the effect was transformative. One officer, whose journal was later archived in Gunter Bischoff's accounts of civilian processing, noted the quiet astonishment of female arrivals. They did not trust our gestures at first. Eyes darted to hands, lips pursed against the possibility of cruelty. And yet nothing came. A young woman, barely 17, whispered to another, "Do you think they like us?" Her voice trembled, half with fear, half with disbelief. The other shook her head, but not out of doubt, out of a learned habit of caution. Weeks of forced labor and abuse had taught them that hope could be dangerous. Yet the soldier kneeling to help her gather bundles of clothing smiled politely, offering no expectation, no insult, just the simple acknowledgement of her presence. Even the men among them, those not yet fully certain of their own survival, could not hide their amazement. One POW observed quietly from the sidelines, "I've been fed, clothed, given a cot, yet watching them, the soldiers, I feel like I've stepped into a different world." A world where you can be afraid and not punished for it. The irony was not lost on anyone. Here, in the middle of a war that had trained each human being to suspicion and cruelty, small acts of fumbling kindness created a surreal theater of civility. A soldier tripped over a mess tray, flustered. Muttering apologies in German, he barely spoke. The women snickered behind their hands, a laugh so quiet it was almost a gasp. For a moment, the camp seemed suspended between the horror of recent memory and the unimaginable calm of respect. And yet, this was only the beginning. The fear that had gripped them for years had not vanished overnight. Their eyes still scanned every corner, ready for betrayal. But as blankets were passed, as hands were extended, as meals were offered without derision, something imperceptible began to change. A spark of trust flickered where only terror had lived. A question lingered, unspoken but felt in every cautious step. Could men in uniform, supposed enemies, ever be allies even for a fleeting moment? By the end of that first day, the women sat together on rough wooden benches, hands wrapped around tin cups of soup, their bodies tense yet slightly relaxed. The sky darkened beyond the barbed wire, the wind no less bitter, but inside the barracks, a fragile human warmth had begun to take root. They had expected cruelty. They had expected humiliation. Instead, they had received something far stranger and more disarming: respect. And, as they lay down on thin cots, the muffled sounds of soldiers cleaning the mess hall drifting through the air, one thought began to take hold, timid but persistent. Perhaps not every human being was a threat. Perhaps in the midst of this mechanized, brutal war, they could find something resembling normalcy. But as the night deepened and the wind rattled the barracks like a cautionary whisper, none of them could know what came next. And what came next, as they would soon learn, would challenge every expectation they had carried into Camp Ashwood. Morning broke over Camp Ashwood with a pale, gray light that seeped through the narrow slats of the barracks, dust motes drifting in the beams like tiny, reluctant witnesses. The women rose from their thin cots, stiff from nights spent curled against shivering cold, expecting the usual regimented order, the brusque commands, perhaps even sneers. But the soldiers were already moving about quietly, hands full of steaming bowls and folded blankets, their expressions careful, even deferential. At the mess hall, a long table had been hastily arranged, tin cups and trays set with military precision. The women hesitated at the threshold, eyes flicking to the soldiers who held ladles with tentative patience. One young woman, clutching her sleeve, stepped forward first. The soup was simple: potatoes, thin broth, a hint of carrot, but served with a courtesy she had never known. "Please," said a sergeant, his voice low and even, gesturing to the steaming trays. The woman blinked, then hesitated, half expecting mockery or ridicule. None came. Outside, the camp's daily routines unfolded like a carefully rehearsed ballet. Soldiers guided women to latrines, held open doors, offered blankets against the chill. One officer helped a woman whose shoe had split in the mud, muttering, almost apologetically, "It's too small, I'm afraid, but perhaps better than nothing." She could only nod, cheeks flushing, not from embarrassment, but from the inconceivable gentleness of the act. She had been trained to fear men like this, to expect only calculation and cruelty. Yet here they moved with caution, almost reverence. The contrast was jarring. Weeks in forced labor, months in camps where bodies were currency and words were weapons, had left their minds primed for betrayal. And yet, every interaction contradicted expectation. One soldier knelt beside a woman's bundle of clothing, attempting to untangle a knot in a scarf. His hands trembled slightly, fumbling over the threadbare fabric. The woman's lips quirked upward in a brief, incredulous smile, the first sign of relief she had allowed herself since the war had reached her doorstep. Historical records from U.S. Army archives confirm that camps like Ashwood emphasized humane treatment for civilians and noncombatants. Medical care, minimal though it sometimes was provided. Abuse was met with strict disciplinary action. Chaplains and nurses documented encounters in journals that survive today, noting the surprise, sometimes disbelief, on the faces of German women who had never known such civility. They did not understand why, wrote a nurse in April 1945, but the quiet respect given to them was a revelation, almost a shock to their system. In the barracks, moments of normalcy emerged. A woman allowed a soldier to adjust her coat, straightening the hem and brushing a lock of hair from her face. Another shared a timid laugh as a young private tripped over a mess tray, muttering apologies in broken German, which elicited stifled giggles from women who had long forgotten the sound of amusement. These tiny gestures, seemingly mundane, carried a weight far greater than any weapon. They were proofs of humanity in a landscape dominated by war and fear. Outside the barracks, work assignments were carefully administered. Women were given manageable tasks, tending small gardens, assisting in kitchens, or helping sort clothing for incoming civilians. Soldiers supervised, but without the harshness or jeers that had characterized the last year of their lives. One officer, noting the careful attention to dignity, reflected later in his journal, "They are not enemy soldiers. They are human beings. Treating them with respect is not charity. It is recognition of that simple fact." As days passed, the women began to adapt, not fully trusting, but slowly allowing themselves to respond with small gestures of gratitude or curiosity. A simple question about a meal, a shared smile during chores, an exchange of names, all became acts of bravery in a world that had stripped them of agency. Even the men among them, watching quietly, were reminded that war was not total dehumanization, that civility could survive, even in a landscape designed for cruelty. The irony of the situation did not escape anyone. These women, conditioned to expect brutality, were receiving kindness delivered with fumbling precision. A young soldier carrying a stack of blankets nearly toppled them over a chair, muttering verdammt under his breath, while the women laughed quietly, the sound fragile but liberating. Even small accidents became a bridge between fear and trust, humanizing both sides of a divide carved by ideology and violence. By the end of the week, routines had taken shape. The women walked the camp paths with less caution, their eyes scanning less for threats and more for familiarity. Meals were shared, clothing distributed, small chores completed with cooperation rather than fear. The guards had become a strange sort of family, not by choice, but by necessity and the human instinct to recognize decency where it existed. One young woman whispered to another as they gathered firewood, "I never thought a man could ask my name without meaning harm." The other smiled, a hint of disbelief still lingering, but perhaps a faint hope taking root. Camp Ashwood, in this small corner of a continent ravaged by total war, became a place where respect, patience, and human decency were revolutionary acts. The women had arrived expecting cruelty, anticipating humiliation. Instead, they found an odd equilibrium. The daily choreography of survival carried out with attentiveness, without insult or exploitation. In the quiet moments between duties, in the shared laughter over spilled soup, and in the careful gestures of those who might once have been enemies, a transformation began, small, tentative, but undeniable. And though the war still raged beyond the barbed wire, for these women, a new reality had emerged, one in which trust, however fragile, was possible, and respect could be extended even in the shadow of fear. Yet as they lay down that night on their thin cots, the wind still rattling the barracks like a somber metronome, they could not know how fragile this calm truly was. For even amid acts of human kindness, The machinery of war was relentless, and the lessons of trust and dignity they had learned here would soon be tested in ways they could not yet imagine.